Welcome to the Political Risk Podcast, a risk, insurance and geopolitics mix. I'm your host, David Benyon, and my guest is Firas Modad. The topic is method to Trump's madness. Firas Modad is a globally respected analyst and thought leader, focused on the commercial impact of geopolitical risk in the Middle East and globally. He leads the Modad Geopolitics risk consultancy, which has a strong track record of commercially relevant forecasts that have helped insurers, banks, traders, investors and security professionals, among others. Modad Geopolitics works with sensitive topics and high-level clients, including C-suite executives, government officials, bankers, energy execs, chief security officers, and insurance industry leaders, helping investors and insurers to select risks, for instance, and understand likely geopolitical changes and mitigate risks to their portfolio. Now, we recorded just before the dramatic tariff news globally in the past fortnight. Although the Trump administration has U-turned, at least for now, on most of those tariffs, of course they've notably stayed in place for China. They've been countered and ramped up, suggesting the two countries are now in a trade war. I think that narrowing focus on China fits quite well with Firas's theory of what the Trump administration is trying to achieve. His way of thinking links together several points of friction between the US and Europe. Everything from Elon Musk's comments about the UK grooming gang scandal, Trump's persistent comments about wanting to annex Greenland, his seemingly soft stance on Russia and trying to find a peace settlement for the war in Ukraine, and of course, the focus on countering or containing China. Firas has some bold and well-expressed ideas, so whether or not you agree with every letter, it's certainly a thought-provoking episode. Enjoy the conversation. Welcome to the pod, Firas.
Thank you very much for having me.
First of all, before we get going into the actual sort of topic, let's talk about your business. So could you describe it, who you work with and what it is that you do?
My company is called Modad Geopolitics. We cover the commercial impact of geopolitical risk. This is what we focus on. We try to help clients understand what is changing in global geopolitics and how that affects their business. And what we try to do is to really have a developed understanding of the intentions of the various actors that we're analyzing by focusing very much on understanding their worldview, understanding their public statements, and seeing the world as they see it. From that, we look at their capabilities and see to what extent can they match their stated intentions with their capabilities. Using those two factors, we try to forecast what they're going to do, and we try to give clients a view on risk that is highly commercially focused and that allows them to navigate doing business in a rather challenging environment.
And what proportion of your book is made up of, let's say, insurance market?
Almost half of our work is with the insurance industry, and we help them with political risk, we help them with violent risk, we help them with modeling disasters and understanding what are the actual worst-case scenarios, realistic worst-case scenarios that they might be facing, and we provide them with regular updates that help them understand the risks that they're taking, but also sometimes educate their clients and educate their brokers so that their conversations are a little more productive.
Yeah, so when I understand it might differ for each client, but do you have a general approach when you speak to your clients?
We try to tailor what we tell our clients to the right level of focus that they require. So we can tell them about the big geopolitical picture globally, we can tell them about the country level, and we can drill down to the industry and company level to allow them to get an extremely granular picture. So we talk to them, I'd like to say, at the right level of zoom that they're interested in.
And for the insurance clients, let's say underwriters, whether that's for political risk or on the property side, war, political violence and terrorism, what do you think they're most looking for?
In the political risk world, what they're trying to see, aside from some trade finance and things like that, is look at some of the long-term contracts and some of the long-term risks that they have on their books and maintain a good capacity to monitor how that risk is changing and what do they need to do about it. With the political violence and property side, it's rather similar, but it's just a little more focused on the immediate outlook, mostly on the one-year outlook. So the big difference tends to be the time frame. for a lot of these risks.
So let's move on to the main topic we'll talk about today. Since Trump took office in January, a lot of the policy making to a layman, looks pretty random. It looks chaotic, wild. One person described it recently, which I quite liked. But what we're seeing at the moment in the way that Trump and his team are engaging with traditional allies in the West, as well as with Russia, Ukraine, it looks pretty confusing. So what do you think is the strategy, the method in the madness behind it all?
Let's start with where we are right now. Because of the way that administrations from Clinton through Biden have behaved, we've ended up in a situation where Russia, China, and Iran are locked into an alliance. They don't particularly like each other or trust each other very much, but Western pressure on all of them has brought them together. This is an alliance that can dominate all of the resources of mainland Asia and pump these resources into the Chinese manufacturing machine. This is the biggest economic threat that the West is facing.
It's Eurasia. Anyone who plays Risk knows you can't lose the game if you hold Eurasia.
If you hold Eurasia, you never lose the game. Exactly. And the result of the policies from Bush Sr. through to Biden has been you're losing the game of risk. And so what Trump is trying to do is to say the following. First, Europe is not a geopolitical player, and it's not really a partner, because every time there's an economic crisis that needs to be bailed out, every time there's a security issue, the Americans need to intervene. Therefore, there's no value in talking to Europe.
So Europe is more of a client.
Europe is a province in the American empire. And the same is true for Canada.
I mean, we're not drawing the map pink or putting flags on it yet, but it's a sort of economic
It's
empire.
always been the world that we live in. I tell people that I don't object to empires for the same reason I don't object to elephants. It's part of nature. They're there. Deal with it. So the Americans have an empire, except that previously they used to be very polite about it and didn't like to express themselves as an empire would. This led to confusion, especially in the minds of Europeans, who think that they are equals of the Americans. They are not. The Americans are saying, rather than allow this Chinese, Russian, Iranian alliance to continue and to dominate Eurasia and to beat us, the answer is going to be to separate Russia from that alliance. Because as a matter of strategy, it is an irrelevant detail where the border between Russia and Ukraine sits. If you accept that the population of Kharkiv and Odessa is mostly Russian, it really doesn't matter if their capital is in Kiev or Moscow.
Russian-speaking, maybe.
Russian-speaking, fine. So from their perspective, this border doesn't really matter. And the consequences of pushing Russia into China's arms and giving China a monopsony on Russian natural resources and a monopoly on the export of goods to Russia is reckless policy. So it is better to negotiate this border with the Russians and get them to a position where they're comfortable so that the Russians can play a different geopolitical role, which is working to contain China. If the sanctions on Russia are removed, they can then supply their natural resources to the Korean manufacturing machine and to the Japanese manufacturing machine, as well as the Western, American, German, etc. This would mean that you end up in a situation where countries like Japan, the Koreas, the Philippines, Russia are working together to contain China. And so it becomes an acceptable loss if China takes Taiwan, so long as it's still contained and there's a containment policy.
This is massive in terms of the long game, because it's already a leap in a lot of people's minds to say it's a matter of detail where a new border is drawn in Ukraine, whether it's which side of the Dnieper it's on, or whether a few key towns that are behind the current line of contact were to end up in Russian hands. That's already quite controversial. But to say that Taiwan is, maybe not admit it, but to say that it cannot be held if it comes to it is huge. But it does remind me a little bit of pre-World War II. The Americans knew really that they couldn't defend the Philippines. Mm-hmm. They sort of had fudges of war plans that implied they would defend it, but they really knew they couldn't. So yeah, similar situation.
In reality, Taiwan can't be defended for a very long time. The Chinese have a well-established and well-developed plan on how to blockade Taiwan and stop all of its ports from functioning. And once the Taiwanese lose their 1 million barrels a day of oil imports, as well as their gas imports, they are in very real trouble. They have an oil reserve, but the gas reserve is inadequate.
But it doesn't matter so long as you have this wider containment of China.
Precisely. That's the message, which is where the tariffs on TSMC come in, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, the microchips guys. This is intended to force the Taiwanese to relocate production to the United States before Taiwan is lost. And then in that picture, Canada and Greenland fit in quite well in two ways.
You've anticipated me, yeah. So moving to the focus to Canada, Greenland and the Arctic, where does that fit into this whole theory?
So the idea of taking Canada and Greenland involves two parts. First is better American defense in the Arctic, improving America's ability to defend itself.
Does it not matter that Canada is already integrated with NORAD and that Greenland is already in the hands of a NATO ally?
There's a big problem with Canada in the extent of Chinese intelligence penetration of the country, where the Canadians have tried to play a balancing game against the Americans, sort of like the Scots did against the English before the unification of the English and Scottish kingdoms. And this is where it's going to end up. It's going to end up with unification. And with Greenland, there's a similar dynamic. But then the other parts with the defense are the natural resources and the transportation. The Americans want to open the Northwest Passage, which is on the American continent side of the Arctic, similar to how the Russians have been able to open the Northeast Passage through the Arctic and allow a lot more shipping.
That's the one that runs all the way around Russia's far north coast.
Precisely. So if you think of the Earth as a globe, it's basically from Finland, from Norway, all the way getting to Asia. And the Americans want to have a trade route with Korea, Japan, and Asia that sort of bypasses the hot mess that is the Middle East, and that is somewhat shorter, and that's available also for the Europeans. So the Americans think about it, they're trying to integrate the different arms of their empire. It's good for the Europeans in the sense that if they don't have to go through the Mediterranean and then the Red Sea and then Malacca, all of that, they can just go through the Northwest or the Northeast Passage.
What do you say for those people? I mean, because this is an elegant theory in terms of the rationale of it, not necessarily a palatable one for large portions of the world, but especially Europeans and especially Ukrainians. But I can see how in cold rationale it works. But what do you say to those people who would say, myself included, that Trump simply isn't operating on that level? And this is the transactional thing, that he's too focused on the here and now, that he doesn't think through long-term consequences. All this talk of a reverse Nixon, of separating Russia and China. You know, I very much doubt that Trump has read Kissinger's diplomacy.
You would be surprised at how well read Trump is about some issues. From some of the longer interviews that he's had, he seems to be quite knowledgeable and to have a lot of detailed knowledge of things you wouldn't expect him to have. The second point that I would suggest is that if you look at the first few weeks of his presidency, it's very, very obvious that there's a plan in place that's been worked on for a pretty long time, that's being executed ruthlessly with the objective of gutting the political economy of the Democratic Party, of his rivals, basically. This is demonstration of the level of planning that he has. Plus, if you consider the fact that this man has destroyed the Republican establishment and tamed it to his will, stupid people don't do that. It takes a huge amount of skill and competence to do that. There are different kinds of intelligence. We're accustomed to a high level of verbal intelligence. People like David Cameron, who are on paper very smart, in practice absolutely destructive. We're not accustomed to somebody like Trump, who is verbally all over the place. His ideas clearly a race ahead of him, but he's shown more than once that he's able to execute a disciplined plan.
So let's focus on Western Europeans, as we're sat in London today. We're both residents of this country. What this means for especially the UK, France and Germany.
Well, what the Trump administration will try to do is to try to force regime change throughout Western Europe to fundamentally change the EU. In the same way that the administration sees that it needed to destroy the old Republican Party and recreate it, and now is in the process of destroying elements of the American government and recreating them, it will extend that to Europe. You've seen in the 50s and in the 60s all kinds of American intervention in Western elections, the Italian elections and the French elections most famously. More recently, you saw the color revolution phenomenon, whereby a combination of media narratives, social media, and legitimate grievances were used to instigate regime change. And you saw that very powerfully in the Arab world. In 2008, the American State Department said to Twitter, don't do maintenance because Iranian protests are being organized around Twitter. If you do maintenance now, this might cause the protests to die down. So we know that there's this link between the technology companies, the State Department, and forcing governments to change. This is going to be applied to Western Europe because that apparatus used to be in the hands of the old security establishment. Now we've seen all of the technology oligarchs bend the knee to Trump, attend his inauguration, and say that they will be subservient to the order that he is trying to create.
And we saw this with Elon Musk weighing in on UK policy.
We saw that with Elon Musk really doing a lot of damage to Keir Starmer on the Pakistani grooming gang scandals. We saw that with Musk putting pressure to get the AfD a higher share of the vote. And remember, none of these parties needs to win an election outright. What they need to do is to force the mainstream parties to change their policies.
That's what I was going to get at. So regime change, I think when people hear that phrase, they think Baghdad.
Right.
Think
no, so we're thinking of something less extreme.
Yeah, so this is more changing the narrative, changing the policies, potentially in the case of, maybe a coalition, you may see some of the more hard right elements entering into government office positions, but something a little bit more subtle.
But it depends, because these things, once you allow them to happen, they can get out of control.
I mean, for example, AfD didn't make the gains in Germany that some people thought it might, but it made enough gains that it could maybe influence other centrist parties to pander a little bit to try and peel away its voters. Right?
In the same way that the Reform Party has forced the mainstream Conservative Party to attempt to outflank it from the right on questions of immigration and integration. So again, the success of those parties isn't just about them winning the elections.
But the colour revolutions you mentioned, so yeah, you already gave a good example of how that has been linked to US technology giants and their role in that. But I mean, these are not CIA engineered plots in a way that, you sort of clumsy things during the Cold War with regard to Cuba and Latin America.
Some of the CIA interventions in the West were quite sophisticated and quite successful.
No, but what I'm saying is these are genuine outpourings of popular unrest in the countries where they took place.
Well, in the West, I'm telling my clients that the risk of rioting in Western Europe is severely underestimated, and that the French riots that we saw in 2023, which caused a couple of billion euros of damage, can very easily repeat themselves in a range of other countries, with the UK being a serious candidate for that.
And this is very much in the minds of insurance companies, clearly, when it comes to what they call strikes, riots, civil commotion. So it's a civil unrest piece, particularly in markets that buy a lot of insurance in Western Europe, and particularly those markets that those policies would be affected by it are within property business, which they are largely in the UK and in France and in the US. So yeah, I was going to ask you the business consequences that stem from this, thinking about Western Europe in particular.
Thinking about Western Europe, I would think that anything involving green energy faces enormous political risks. If you're in wind or solar in Western Europe, especially in Northern Europe, you really have a big problem coming your way in the next few years, with a lot of these contracts cancelled or reviewed for corruption or all kinds of targeting against anything to do with green energy. That's one. Secondly, I would suggest that most funding that is reliant on the government and that is superfluous, such as the car market here in the UK with the Motability scheme, such as all kinds of subsidies, formal and informal, all kinds of welfare, this is facing very serious risks in Europe in the next 5 or 10 years, probably much sooner in very realistic scenarios. I would also suggest that the risk of rioting in the West is quite serious, when there is going to be enormous pressure to cut welfare, there will be commensurate pressure to begin cutting welfare to migrants first and to people who are born abroad first, regardless of the piece of paper that they hold that defines their nationality now. When this happens, you're going to get a lot of very disgruntled people. And moreover, once that Overton window shifts, the white population of Europe is also going to be more willing to express itself politically. So you end up with a scenario of street clashes between different groups of protesters. These are serious risks that the Europeans are facing. For the defense industry, this is potentially positive because the Europeans understand now that they need to rearm. But to take that seriously, we'd need to see them focusing on making energy cheap. You can't have a viable defense industry and expensive energy. This isn't realistic.
Why is that?
Because producing weapons is extremely energy intensive. You're talking steel, you're talking chemicals. These are the most energy intensive manufacturing sectors in the world. You can't be serious about rebuilding your armament capabilities if you're going to be importing these things from the Chinese. This is simply not serious.
If Europe wants to go it alone, we see this in terms of Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron with the summitry and the emergency meetings and the pledges being made and a fund to arm Ukraine and the movement of defence budgets up to 2.5, then to 3, maybe even 3.5% of GDP within what was currently thought to be impossible. Then it becomes the end of the decade, then it could be maybe in the next couple of years, maybe the NATO summit next year. So all that stuff, if Europe does try and more go its own way, are you saying that it cannot avoid these traps?
I'm saying much more than that. I'm saying, firstly, that there must be a whole-scale reduction in the scale of civil service and welfare to make contracting easier and to just reduce the enormous overhead costs that Western governments have. This is requirement number one. Then requirements number 2 and 3 are materiel and personnel. In terms of materiel, I think the key issue is reducing energy costs. You're not going to get cheap energy from wind farms in Germany. That's just not going to happen. It doesn't work this way. It's not cheap and it's not reliable. The second point, when it comes to personnel, people won't fight for an economic zone that's open to everybody. People fight for God and country. If you're going to motivate people to fight, you will have to have a nationalistic narrative. That nationalistic narrative clashes head-on with the multiculturalism narrative that has been imposed on the West for a very long time. So for a lot of people in Europe who are the natural candidates to go and join the armed forces, they would be described today as far right, and they would be considered unwelcome. And from their perspective, they see a bigger threat from the migrants who are in their societies than they do from the Russians or the Chinese, who are thousands of miles away. So for Europe to be taken seriously in terms of defense, the kind of transformation that needs to happen is bottom-up across the entire political establishment. So when Keir Starmer and Macron and all of these others talk about we're going to be a geopolitical player, we're going to be standing up to both the Russians and the Americans and the Chinese, this is not to be taken seriously. They're going to spend money, maybe, but all that will do is that it will increase their levels of debt. These are countries, for the most part, aside from Germany, with very high and unsustainable debts. When you include the unfunded pension liabilities, even Germany is in very serious trouble. And they all have pretty large budget deficits in peacetime. So the idea that they are able to embark on some major defense expansion is just not serious.
It makes a lot of sense theoretically. I'm not sure I agree with you on everything you're saying, but we're certainly seeing evidence for some of this. But it's a high-risk strategy, and there's so much collateral damage being done already in terms of the long-term alliances and what has been seen as partnerships. I understand you're saying that they're not really been true partners of equals. It's a client relationship to some degree. But it's such a high-risk strategy if this is what is going on, if that's what the Trump administration is trying to do. We're seeing so much collateral damage to those traditional alliance systems, not least NATO, the US, the UK and Europe. What do you think if the plan fails? If it is a plan, if this is deliberate? Yeah. What if it succeeds, and what about the kind of grey area between the two?
Let's start with where we are. The Second World War order is dead. It has been dead for a very long time. People think that this corpse of the post-Cold War order, NATO, the United Nations, and so on, are still relevant. Objectively, they're not. If you have an alliance that includes Montenegro and America, you're just not serious. Alliances require equality. What you have is provinces within the American empire that have become uppity and have decided to lecture the Americans. So this is where we are in terms of just accepting things from a realistic perspective. NATO doesn't exist and cannot exist without the Americans. They know it. If the Russians were to invade Lithuania tomorrow morning, the only people who can do something about this, seriously do something about this, are going to be the Americans. And therefore, it is a decision to be made between Putin and Trump whether or not a country like Lithuania is going to maintain its independence. So we sort of have to start with reality here. The damage that is being done isn't necessarily to the relationship between the Americans and the Europeans. It's to the relationship between the new American establishment under Trump that is in the process of being formed and the existing European establishment represented by people like von der Leyen, represented by people like Kellas, represented by Starmer, Macron, etc. It's a fight between two competing establishments. And the European establishment doesn't have a single company that can compete with some of the things that the Americans are doing. There's nothing that is serious in Europe in terms of high volume, very advanced drone production. There's nothing serious in terms of a competitor to Starlink, which is what's keeping the Ukrainians fighting. People forget that the minute that Elon Musk turns off Starlink in Ukraine, that's it. It's over. And people like to forget these kinds of details. These details are important and they should not be forgotten. So I think that the idea that there's damage to the Europeans, no, there's a extremely incompetent, out of touch establishment in all of Western Europe that has been consistently failing to deliver to its public. This establishment has been summoned by the imperial power and been told that it no longer gets to be in charge. This is what's happening. It's a Roman emperor dismissing one of his provincial governors. It's slightly more complex than that because of the fictions that we maintain about independence and autonomy and things of that nature. But if every time there's a security threat, you need to be saved by the Americans, and every time there's an economic crisis, the Federal Reserve must bail out the ECB, the Bank of England, the Bank of Sweden, and the Swiss Central Bank, then this independence and autonomy is theoretical.
I understand that what you're saying, but let's say if the Trump administration leans on Europeans to make this come about, well, firstly, I can't see the Baltic states just falling over and agreeing to become Russian provinces. Mm-hmm. And the Poles bought an enormous amount of armoured vehicles in recent years, and were it not for the unfortunate matter of nuclear weapons, I'm pretty sure the Poles could go toe-to-toe with the Russians. They've got a lot of power. One Russian army has already been destroyed in Ukraine. We're now facing a sort of second-rate, not particularly effective, the front line moves very slowly. I'm reminded of something that Donald Tusk said recently, that, you've got 500 million Europeans asking 300 million Americans for protection against 40 million Russians who have failed in 3 years to subdue 50 million Ukrainians. What I'm saying is, are you not sort of overestimating Russian power and capability in this equation? Do they actually have the power to move the borders if Europeans oppose it?
If it was only about the numbers, then Taiwan wouldn't be a semi-autonomous province or an autonomous province or whatever you want to call it. If it was only about the numbers, then the most developed country in Africa would be Nigeria and not South Africa. So the idea that it's only a question of numbers isn't a realistic one. That's point one. Point two, for the kind of movement of front lines, please factor in that the Israelis have been fighting Hamas for 18 months now, and Hamas is still not fully beaten. Please factor in that when the Israelis tried to enter South Lebanon, they managed to advance on a few hills, but it took them weeks and it came at a high cost. The speed at which the front line moves has very dramatically changed. The last thing that I would mention is that when you are thinking about Ukraine in particular, the Ukrainian military is severely overstretched. And what the Russians are trying to do is to increase that overstretch and to just open up new fronts that force the Ukrainians to pin down more and more of their forces. At some point when breaks happen, they then multiply and accelerate. And that's the direction in which things are going in Ukraine. So I accept that the Russians did badly in the first days of the invasion in one perspective, but in the first days of the invasion, they also took a quarter of Ukraine. They also got to Zaporozhye in the first few days of the invasion. It was mainly in the north where they faced trouble with the advance on Kiev. And they've been able to hold the territories that they took in the first days of the invasion, with the exception of a section of Kharkiv, a section of Kherson where they withdrew voluntarily, and Kiev where they say it was negotiated. Whether or not that's true, I don't have a view.
Well, they've got their land bridge to Crimea and they've got most of Donbass.
Exactly. And they're grinding down the Ukrainian military rather effectively. I'm just not convinced that the Europeans can do very much just because there are 300 million of them. In the same way that when Apple went to produce iPhones in India, the population size of India didn't help. They had to find somewhere else. Not everything is a numbers game. I would also suggest that, again, if the Europeans are going to be serious military players, it's not going to be for an economic zone. It's not going to be based on the idea that everybody's welcome and we're multicultural. That's not what people fight for. This is exactly why the Lebanese army is useless, by the way. The Lebanese army is absolutely useless when push comes to shove because it doesn't have the kind of cohesion that is based on nationalism and or shared religious beliefs that would actually animate people.
That's all for now, and I hope you enjoyed that roller coaster ride through what might lie behind the geopolitics we're seeing in the headlines, and what it may mean for the future of Europe in particular. Personally, I agree to some degree, but I doubt that Trump has his plans quite so clearly thought out. I'm more of a believer that we're seeing chaos, mischief-making, and opportunism, with a short-term focus on deal-making, extracting financial gains, and shaking down those free-riding Europeans. Please tune in next time, when there'll be another episode within a fortnight, already planned, featuring AIRMIC, the Membership Association of Risk Professionals and Insurance Buyers, timed to mark the first 100 days of the new Trump administration. I've been your host, David Benyon, and I'd like to thank my guest for this episode, Firas Modad. Production was by Peter McGill, and Lawrence Durkin made the music.